Hello, thank you for accessing our recording. We hope that this training enables you to provide the most detailed and accurate reporting of your grant-funded work on your semi-annual progress report. Accurate data reporting is important for many reasons. Your quantitative and qualitative data enable VAWA's effectiveness to be measured. VAWA MEI creates reports for OVW using your data and the data from grantees across the country. The summary data reports support OVW to make requests for increased appropriations and to defend VAWA funding to decision makers. Your data also helps OVW to make sure federal funds are being spent appropriately and to measure the performance of grant programs. Additionally, every 2 years, the Attorney General is required to submit a report to Congress on the overall effectiveness of VAWA funding. VAWA grantee data makes up a significant part of that mandated report. The more consistently grantees fill out their reports, the more accurately VAWA's effectiveness can be measured through these means. It is your responsibility as a federal grantee to submit data on your funded program every 6 months. In a moment, we will talk further about why your data matters and how it is used. But first, let's go over the reporting process. First, you are awarded your grant. The moment you become a grantee, you are mandated to complete the semi-annual progress reporting form twice a year. As previously mentioned, this is due in January and July of each year, and it is due 30 days after the close of the reporting period. This means that on January 30th and July 30th every single year, your semi-annual progress report is due. You will access this progress report in your Grants Management System account, also referred to as GMS. When you download the report each period, please make sure you are downloading the correct form for the correct reporting period. Otherwise, you will not be able to successfully submit your form. We encourage you to download the report to your desktop so that you can work on it in more than one sitting. When you are ready to submit the report, you will validate it and upload it back into the Grants Management System. And next, your report is reviewed by your program specialist at OVW. They look at every report that is submitted by all VAWA grantees before they send the information on to us. If they contact you during their review and they request a change, they are asking you to change your report, and you will need to make that change and re-upload it into the GMS system. Once they have approved all the reports, they send that information on to us at VAWA MEI. At VAWA MEI, we review the data and look for any inconsistencies or questions that pop up. While we go over the data, we may contact you via email or phone with questions about what you have reported so that we can better understand it. If any changes are needed, we will make them on our end, and you will not need to resubmit your report to GMS. Once we have finished reviewing the data, we create reports for OVW and send them back to OVW. These reports are also posted to our website. Let's look a little more closely into how to best approach the reporting process. As previously mentioned, the moment you become a grantee, you are mandated to complete all the semi-annual progress reports every 6 months. If funding has yet to be released to your program or you have not used any funds yet, you are still required to complete this report. So if you are not using funds yet for grant-funded activities, you only need to complete the sections of the report that are mandatory, such as the general information, coordinated community response, and the narrative. You will know if it's a mandatory section because those sections are labeled as all grantees must complete this subsection. We ask that grantees fill these sections out and then also provide narrative explaining that your organization has not used grant money to support activities yet, or indicate that your budget is still pending OVW approval. We will see these notes in the narrative and we'll address the grantee data accordingly. Once you do begin using your grant funds, you will still need to answer the mandatory sections of the form, but now you will also be filling out any sections that relate to your grant-funded activities. You will not fill out sections of the form that you are not using grant funds for. So for instance, if you did not use your grant funds during the current reporting period for training professionals, you're going to click no at the start of that section and leave the whole section blank. It's very important to remember that on this form, you only report on grant-funded activities, and blank sections can be explained using the narrative at the very end of the form. What if you have to submit more than one report in the same reporting period? This does sometimes happen. It may be the case if you close out one grant and begin a new grant with the same reporting period. If this is the case, we ask that you do your best to divide the staff FTEs and activities based on which of the grants funded which of the activities. You're not going to double count FTEs or activities. For instance, if a full-time staff person was paid by Grant A for 3 months and then paid by Grant B for the other 3 months of the reporting period, their time should be split on the 2 reports and not reported as one full-time FTE on both of the reports. This is important. Once you have determined how you will divide your data between the 2 reports that you need to submit, OBW and VAWA MEI ask that grantees use the final narrative question on that form to list the project numbers for both awards, indicate the time periods that were covered by each award, and verify how you have split up your data between the 2 reports that you're submitting. Here are a few tips before we begin looking at the sections on the reporting form. Please read the separate instructions. There are many helpful examples or definitions in there to assist you in filling out the reporting form. Throughout this form, there are other categories listed for many questions. In general, we ask that you use the other category only as a last resort. If you can find a way to put the information into a category that already exists or that is a close fit, please do so. When we aggregate data for reports, often answers in the other categories are not included in those aggregated reports. If you do choose to use the other category, please be very specific. And for example, if you have more than one entry, let us know how the overall total is broken down between all of the entries in the other description. Following most sections on the form, you're going to find optional narrative questions. And you can use these questions to talk about the unique successes of your program. For any difficulties, you can give examples or provide information from evaluations or exit interviews with people served by your program. You can include stories of successful intervention or any difficulties you had with collecting the data. This narrative data is very useful, so please definitely utilize it. We ask that you try not to use acronyms or abbreviations in your data. If you do use an acronym, please provide an explanation in each question where you use that acronym so that we can tell what you're talking about. Do not use attachments or extra documents to provide data that is requested on this report. Only data that is contained in the reporting form itself will be received and analyzed by VAWA MEI. And as always, please feel free to give us a call or send an email to VAWA MEI with any questions you have going through the report. Okay, let's jump into the reporting form. The first section is Section A1, Grant Information. For question 1, fill in the date you upload your report to GMS and submit to OBW. Questions 2 through 4 will be pre-populated for you when you download your form from GMS. Please make sure the information in those questions is correct. Question 5 asks for the type of lead agency organization. Choose the one description that most closely resembles your agency or organization. Note, there was an addition of state coalition and tribal coalition categories to question 5. This is an update reflecting the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. Question 5A is a new question which is an update reflecting the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. Question 5A asks that if the lead agency is a coalition or a victim services organization, then check the government types that best describe your project partners. For question 5B, indicate if your agency is a faith-based organization. Question 6 asks for the point of contact. For this question, please provide contact information for the person who knows the most about the day-to-day activities funded by your ICJR grant. This is a person we might call or email to ask questions about the data. Question 7 asks if your grant specifically addresses tribal populations. If you indicate yes to this question, please list out the specific tribal populations. Answers such as all tribes in our state or the use of etc. are not valid responses here. This should not include tribal populations who just happen to live in your service area, or if an American Indian or Alaska Native just happens to come in for services. In most cases, if you indicate yes to this question, your program's intentions are to focus on serving those specific tribes or nations, and it probably would have been included in your grant proposal. For question 8, percentage of funds directed to each area, please report the areas addressed by your ICJR program grant during the current reporting period and estimate the approximate percentage of funds or resources committed to each area. When determining the percentage, take into account the number of cases or clients, the amount of time spent on cases, training activities, the sources of referrals, etc. The total for this section must equal 100%, and it can fluctuate between reporting periods. Next is section A2, staff information. This is where staff funded by the ICJR grant are reported. If your ICJR grant funds were used to fund staff positions, make sure you check yes at the beginning of this section in order to unlock the rest of the fields on the PDF. When you're considering reporting staff, only report FTEs for staff whose salary is provided fully or partially by grant funds and includes staff time of contracted work. Report by activity performed rather than by job title. If a staff member falls into 2 or more categories, please divide the FTE value associated with that staff into the applicable categories. Report out to the second decimal, for example, 1.25 FTEs. Time should be prorated if necessary, such as when someone is part-time, was hired partway through the grant reporting period, if they're a contractor, or if they are full-time but only partially funded by the ICJR program fund. Please use the other categories sparingly. For the most part, all activities performed by staff are included in the listed categories. If you do need to use the other category, though, please be specific, and any other descriptor correlate each entry with its own FTE amount. Okay, we're going to look at this quick cheat sheet. It's a fact sheet for calculating FTEs. This chart can help you with calculating FTEs for a full 40-hour work week. FTEs should be based on the 26-week or 6-month reporting period that just ended. And in a 6-month reporting period, there are a total of 1,040 working hours. for someone who works full-time at 40 hours a week. So you can use the math that's illustrated here on this chart to help you calculate your FTE funding, with, especially if you know how many hours somebody is working in a 6-month period, if you know how many hours a week they are grant funded. So we're going to go through a couple of examples. Okay, so in example 1, the first point to keep in mind is that you're going to report only ICJR grant-funded personnel. Your organization received an ICJR program grant that was used to fund one full-time probation officer whose salary is 75% grant funded, and another full-time probation officer whose salary is 15% grant funded. In this case, you would report only the ICJR program-funded personnel's time. So the correct FTE under probation officer would be that 75% plus the 15%, or 0.75 plus 0.15. So the FTE itself would be 0.90, which you can see in our example GMS form to the right of the screen. The second point to keep in mind is that you're reporting by job function and not by job title. So in example 2, your ICJR grant was used to fund a full-time program coordinator who spends 26 hours a week coordinating program activities and 14 hours a week providing victim assistance. In this case, you would divide their time by their function. So the correct FTE under program coordinator would be 0.65, which is the same as 26 hours out of 40 hours a week. And then under victim assistant, the FTE would be 0.35, which is calculated by doing 14 hours a week divided by 40 hours a week. The third point to keep in mind is that you need to prorate FTEs for staff who worked only part of the reporting period. In example 3, the ICJR program grant you received funded a full-time trainer that was hired 2 months into the reporting period. So remember, the reporting period is either January through June or July through December. In this case, you're going to need to prorate the FTE to reflect that this person only worked 4 out of the 6 months during the reporting period. So we can calculate that FTE by doing 4 divided by 6, and the correct FTE under trainer educator would be 0.67 because we're rounding up to the second decimal place. The fourth point to keep in mind is that you're going to convert funding used for contractors or consultants into FTE values. In example 4, the ICJR program grant paid for a prosecutor that was paid for 65 hours of work during the 6-month reporting period. In this case, we would need to convert their time into FTEs, and we can do that by dividing the 65 hours that they were paid by the 1,040 total full-time working hours in a 6-month reporting period. So 65 divided by 1,040 gives us an FTE value of 0.06 FTEs for this prosecutor. Next is section B, purpose areas. All grantees must complete this section, just as it says at the top of the page. For question 10, you should check all statutory purpose areas that apply to the activities engaged in with your ICJR funds during the current reporting period. Note that the purpose areas were recently updated to reflect program changes made by the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. If you are not sure which of the purpose areas you need to check off, you should refer back to your grant proposal. and some of your purpose areas have changed, or if you need to change them, your program specialist at OVW must approve all changes to your purpose areas. For question 11, program priority areas, indicate program priority areas addressed by your ICJR program grant. Priority areas is in reference to a specific item that OVW would have included in the solicitation under which you applied. Some years they include priority areas, and some years they do not. So you may not have anything to report in question 11. If you're not clear about what your program priority areas are, refer back to that solicitation under which you applied, or refer to your grant proposal. Next is section C1, training. Note that there are a couple of spots in the training section that have been updated to reflect the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. Training is defined as activities for professionals or volunteers acting in the role of a professional to improve their response to victim survivors as it relates to their role in the system. You're going to complete this section only if your ICJR funds directly supported the training of non-grant funded people who are professionals or volunteers acting in the role of a professional. Do not count staff development of grant-funded staff in this section. For question 12, training events provided, report all training events that you provided in the current reporting period that were supported by ICJR grant funds. In question 13, number of people trained, you're going to report the number of people trained through the training events that you reported in question 12. Report the attendees by discipline. Go through the list of existing categories, and in the appropriate category, report the number of those people trained. Again, do not count grant-funded staff when you're reporting in question 13. Also note that the categories of military command staff and multidisciplinary have been removed from this list, which is an update that reflects the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. For question 14, training content areas, check all the content areas that were addressed in the training that you provided during the current reporting period. Note that the addition of homicide prevention, lethality assessment, and sexual assault evidence collection kit were added to the justice system section. Deaf and/or hard of hearing and are in a correctional setting, both categories were added to the underserved section. These updates reflect the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. We're going to go over a training example. Let's pretend that the ICJR program grant-funded trainer held 10 training events for professionals this reporting period. Your organization also supported 3 training events with other funds. 210 professionals attended the grant-funded training events, while 45 professionals attended the training events that were provided with other funds. For this example, we're only reporting on grant-funded activities. So in question 12, we would report the 10 training events supported by ICJR grant funds, and we'll report the 210 professionals that attended those 10 events. Question 13 will total for you automatically as you enter data there. Next is section C2, Coordinated Community Response, also said as CCR. CCR provides a picture of the relationships that you have with other agencies and organizations within your community and the frequency with which you interact with these agencies and organizations. This should include all agencies and organizations you interact with, not just your grant or memorandum of understanding MOU partners. Report the different agencies and organizations that you are engaging with in this section. All grantees must answer the coordinated community response question. For this section, check the frequency with which you provide or receive referrals, consultations, and/or technical assistance with agencies and organizations listed in the first section. Report the frequency with which you meet with the agencies or organizations listed in Section 1. These meetings are most often associated with system change, like task force meetings, meetings to address the changes to specific forms, policies, or protocols. And then indicate if the agency or organization is an MOU partner. Next is Section C3, Policies and Legislation. Report only those protocols and policies on which development was completed during the current reporting period. If the policy or protocol is still in the development or revision phase, you should not report on that policy or protocol implemented until the period when it is actually finished. Note, also report on funds used to directly support the development, revision, or implementation of policies or protocols to directly support the development or promotion of state, local, or tribal legislation and policies. By substantially revised, we mean that you spent a good amount of time revising a policy or a protocol. Simply adding the name of another group under your underserved populations policy would not constitute as a significant revision unless separate protocols around how to serve that new group were included. In question 18, check all that apply. There are updates to this question reflecting VAWA 2013 reauthorization as follows. Under the healthcare subsection, the addition of HIV testing programs, counseling, and prophylaxis for victim survivors of sexual assault. Under the victim services and law enforcement subsection, the addition of homicide prevention lethality assessment. Under the victim services, law enforcement, prosecution, court, and healthcare subsections, the addition of sexual assault evidence collection kit. And under the victim services, law enforcement, prosecution, probation, and healthcare subsections, the addition of victim survivor notification and engagement. Question 19 is a new question reflecting the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. In question 19, write about the development or promotion of state, local, or tribal legislation policies. Question 20 is an optional additional narrative question. Next is section C4, products. If ICJR program funds were used to develop or substantially revise products during the current reporting period, then you would check yes at the top of the section and answer question 21. If not, check no and skip to section C5. You would enter the number of developed or revised, which is usually 1, the title or topic, the intended audience, and if it was produced in another language, then please identify that by stating the languages rather than putting a numeric value. If it was only produced in English, you can leave that other languages box blank. Next is section C5, Data Collection and Communication Systems. If your ICJR program funds were used for data collection and/or communication systems for the purchase of hardware or other equipment during the current reporting period, then check yes at the top of this section and answer questions 22 through 23. If not, then you can check no and skip on to section C6. For question 22, report the use of ICJR program funds for data collection and communication systems. Go through the list and check any that apply. For question 23, check the purpose of data collection and/or communication systems. You should also check all that apply in this question, and if you use the other category, please be as specific as possible. Next is section C6, Specialized Unit. If your ICJR program grant-funded staff were part of a specialized unit in any of the categories listed, or if ICJR program funds were used to directly support a specialized unit, check yes and answer questions 24 and 25. If not, then you can check no and skip on to section C7. A specialized unit is a centralized or coordinated group unit or dedicated staff of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, probation officers, or judges responsible for handling domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking cases. Specialized units are within the criminal justice system, and they consist of criminal justice personnel. Next is section C7, System Improvement. If your ICJR program funds were used to support system improvement during the current reporting period, you can check yes and answer question 26. If not, please check no and skip on to section D. For question 26, indicate the system improvement activities engaged in the current reporting period with ICJR program funds and identify the systems in which the improvement occurred. Check all that apply. Next is section B, Victim Services. Note that there are multiple questions in the Victim Services section that have been updated to reflect the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. Complete this section if ICJR program-funded staff provided victim services or if grant funds were used to support victim services during the current reporting period. Most of the data requested in the Victim Services section is congressionally mandated. Congress wants to know how many of the number of victims or survivors seeking services were served and how many could not be served. This section is structured to collect data in accordance with the congressional mandate. Provide information in this section that represents only those victims and survivors served and services provided with ICJR program funding. Please review this section carefully as some questions in this section may seem counterintuitive, some questions are mandatory, and some questions are optional. Remember that you can always contact VAWA MEI if you have any questions about how to report data on this form. Remember that there is a separate instructions document that can be a resource and provide examples. Before we jump into this section, let's first talk about how to determine if a victim is to be reported in this section at all. First, the victim or survivor has to request or accept services before you would report them in this section. It is critical to remember that if a victim or survivor does not request or accept services, they should not be reported in this section. Are the services they are requesting funded under your ICJR grant? You're only going to report on the grant-funded services you provide, not services you provide with other funding. and you will only report on the grant-funded services requested or accepted by the victim. So do not report a victim who only asks for services that are not grant-funded. If your program provides a victim or survivor with a mix of grant-funded and non-grant-funded services, do not report on the program's ability to provide the non-grant-funded services. You should only report on the ability of your program to provide grant-funded services. Finally, the victim or survivor must be a primary victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking to be served by your ICJR grant fund. So as we previously stated, there are some instances when you would not report a victim on this form. Victims who are seeking only services not funded with your ICJR program funds will not be reported. Remember that you're only reporting on grant-funded services. Other instances that will not be captured in Section D include victims who did not accept any of the grant-funded services that you offered or recommended, and people who are primary victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Once you determine whether or not a victim should be reported, then you need to determine if they should be reported as served, partially served, or not served. So once again, they just have to be a primary victim of one of those 4 crimes. They have to accept or receive grant-funded services, and they have to be grant-funded services. These are a couple of definitions of served, partially served, and not served. When determining if a victim is served, partially served, or not served, you're going to report a victim as served if they requested grant-funded services and your program was able to provide all of those grant-funded services. Report a victim as partially served if they requested grant-funded services, but because of programmatic issues such as those listed in question 30, your program could not provide all of the services that they requested. Report a victim as not served if your program could not provide any of the grant-funded services that that victim requested due to programmatic issues such as those listed in question 30. Before we move on, we want to take a quick moment to talk about partially served and not served victims and survivors. We find that grantees are often worried about reporting victims as partially served or not served because they fear that it will appear that they are not meeting their goals or objectives, or that it might shed a negative light on their program. However, by reporting victims as partially served and not served, grantees are helping OBW and decision makers and policymakers understand the scope and burden of violence that stretches far beyond what VAWA funds are able to support. OVW and VAWA MEI know that VAWA funding is not enough to support every victim who requests services from grantees. Therefore, we want to encourage you all to carefully track and report using both quantitative and narrative data to highlight instances of partial and non-service. Narrative data can highlight how long waiting lists affect your ability to provide services, full emergency shelters, or programs' inability to support victims on family court days. Examples like that, the more detail you can provide, all of that helps to show the great need for services that does exist. So how do you report the number of victims each reporting period? You may only count one victim one time during each reporting period in question 27. If an individual victim requests services more than once during that same reporting period, they're still only reported one time in question 27, even if they received multiple services and requested multiple services multiple times. Question 27 is asking for a total count of people, not the total count of services. Note that you can report victims and survivors in each reporting period that they request services. For example, In the previous reporting period, a victim requested civil legal advocacy, and your program provided that service during that previous period, but they're continuing to provide that service during the current reporting period. So you would count this victim in both the previous reporting period form and this current reporting period form. You also need to determine if a victim should be counted as a victim of sexual assault, domestic or dating violence, or stalking. Since you may only count a victim once during each reporting period, if the victim experienced more than one type of victimization, you must determine the most appropriate category in which to report them, and this is at your discretion. Question 30 has been revised to have two columns of check boxes, one for not served and one for partially served. The following other reasons for not serving a victim indicate that the victim should either be classified differently or should not be counted in this section. If you report that a victim did not return, if your program began to provide a victim with grant-funded services that they requested and the victim does not return, the victim withdraws, or the victim relocates, you would count this person as served even if that service was not completed. If the program did not take any action to remove them and the victim removed themselves, then they are counted as served. If you report victim refused services in the other category, if your program offers services usually through outreach and the victim refuses services or does not contact you to accept those services, you would not count them in this section. Only if, because of outreach activities, they request or accept grant-funded services would they be counted in this section. For instance, if you called a victim and told them about all of the services that your program provides and they decline those services, you would not count this person at all in this section. However, if you called the victim and the victim requested and received counseling because of your outreach call, then you would count them in this section. Another thing we sometimes see in the other category is service was not provided by our program. This is not an appropriate other reason. Only factors in services supported with grant funds. So, for example, your ICJR grant funds only support crisis intervention services. If a victim contacts your program seeking crisis intervention and a support group, you should only be considering the grant-funded service, which is crisis intervention in this example. So you would not need to report that they couldn't receive a non-grant funded service in the other category. You're only considering the grant-funded services here. So we shouldn't ever see the service was not provided by our program in question 30. If you could not locate the victim, that is also not an appropriate reason to put in the other category. If your program began to provide the requested services, this person would be counted as fully served. If the person was placed on a wait list and then your program was able to provide that service, but you're not able to locate that victim, count this victim as not served. And most likely you would then indicate that the program reached capacity in order to reflect that your program was not able to provide that service when it was requested. Okay, we're going through a couple of examples about how to capture people in question 27. In example 1, your ICJR funds crisis intervention and transportation. A victim of domestic violence requests crisis intervention and transportation, and you're able to provide the crisis intervention, but not the grant-funded transportation because your office is actually closed during the time that they requested that service. So in this case, the victim received only one out of the two grant-funded services that they requested, so they should be reported as partially served under domestic violence in question 27. and then we'll go down to question 30. And you would check off hours of operation in the first column that is labeled partially served. In example 2, a survivor of sexual assault requested counseling at the beginning of the reporting period, and then that same survivor came back at the end of the reporting period and requested legal advocacy. For this example, you are able to provide both of those grant-funded services. So in this case, the survivor would be reported as fully served. Additionally, although this person requested services at 2 different times for 2 different services, remember that we are only counting that person 1 time in question 27 because it's asking for an unduplicated count of people and not services. In example 3, your ICJR program offers counseling and victim advocacy. A victim of stalking requests these 2 grant-funded services, and you're not able to provide either of those because your program is filled to capacity. So in this instance, you are going to report this victim as not served in question 27 because you were not able to provide either grant-funded service. Then we would go down to question 30 and make sure that we are in the not served second column, and we'll check off program reached capacity. In example 4, your ICJR program grant funds support groups and counseling services. A survivor of sexual assault comes to your office and requests transportation and legal accompaniment, which you are able to provide through other funding. So in this example, the survivor only requested services that are funded through a different stream, not through your ICJR grant. So you're not going to report the individual on this form. Even though you provided services that they requested, they were not supported by ICJR grant funds and they should not be included on this report. Note that question 28 is a new question on the form, which is an update reflecting the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. In this question, report the number of victims or survivors who began receiving ICJR program-funded services during the current reporting period. If this is your first time using ICJR program funds to provide victim services, then all the victims and survivors in question 27A, fully served, and 27B, partially served, should be reported as new in question 28. If the victim or survivor has been counted as served or partially served in a previous reporting period, then do not include them here, even if the victim or survivor sought services for a new victimization. So for example, if you provided services to a domestic violence victim during the previous reporting period, and that victim returned during the current reporting period after being sexually assaulted, you would not report them in this question because they are not new to your program, and instead you would report the additional victimization that they experienced in question 29. Question 29 is a new question, which is an update reflecting the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. Report any additional types of victimizations for which a victim or survivor received ICJR program-funded services during the current reporting period. Report in the row that corresponds to the victimization you reported that victim in question 27A or 27B. So report the victim or survivor only once under each category. Because of VAWA 2013, ICJR grantees are allowed to provide services for trafficking victims, as long as those victims and survivors are also receiving ICJR-funded services for the victimizations of sexual assault, domestic or dating violence, and stalking. Note that this table automatically populates the number of victims or survivors reported as served and partially served in question 27A under each presenting victimization. So for instance, you can see from my previous example where one partially served domestic violence victim was reported that this question automatically populated a 1 under that presenting victimization of domestic violence. It also auto-populated the sexual assault category. For question 31, demographics of victims, survivors partially served or fully served, report the demographics of the victims or survivors you reported in question 27 as fully served or partially served. Remember, you are not capturing demographic information for any of those victims you reported as not served in question 27. If an individual chooses not to answer these demographic questions, please capture that person in the unknown category. Under race ethnicity, the total should equal or be higher than the sum of people who were reported as partially served or fully served. Victims and survivors may report multiple race ethnicities. Please note that individuals may be reported in multiple race ethnicities categories and that this information is self-reported. For gender and age, the total must exactly equal the number of people reported as fully served and partially served. For the other demographics, this section is optional demographic information. The numbers reported in the other demographics are only to reflect the extent of information about victims that you have learned incidentally through providing services. Note that there are updates to the demographic questions, such as so these updates reflect the VAWA 2013 reauthorization. So under the race category, there is a some other race, ethnicity, or origin category now. Under gender, there is a transgender or gender nonconforming category. Under age, the 13 through 17 age category was changed to 11 through 17. And then under the other demographic subsection, there are the categories of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer LGBTQ individuals, and people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Those two categories have also been added. For question 32, reports the victims or survivors' relationships to offenders by type of victimization. So if a victim or survivor experienced more than one type of victimization and or was victimized by more than one perpetrator, count the victim or survivor in all categories that apply. The total reported under each type of victimization should equal or be higher than the total reported in question 27 under that same victimization. So if you reported 30 sexual assault victims, there should be at least 30 sexual assault relationships reported. If you do not know the victim survivor's relationship to their offenders, you can use the relationship unknown category. As much as possible, report the information in these questions, but the information gathered should not be a barrier to service provision. In question 33A, victim services, based on the victims or survivors reported in question 27 as fully and partially served, report the number of victims or survivors who received ICJR program-funded services during the current reporting period. Count each victim or survivor only once for each type of service that that victim or survivor received during the current reporting period in the first column under number of victims or survivors. You may count them in each reporting period that they receive the service, and then report the number of times each grant-funded service was provided. If the only service provided was an intake, this victim should not be counted at all because it is unlikely that a victim requests an intake. The intake is more of a procedure used by an agency and is not a service which a victim requests. If you use the other category, be very specific. Please do not use acronyms. Some acceptable responses in the other category are relocation expenses and supervised visitation. In question 33B, hotline support information and referral, report the number of hotline requests received from victims and survivors and the total number of hotline requests that were responded to by ICJR program-funded staff or with ICJR program funds. Requests reported here should not be reported as victims or survivors in question 27 unless those victims and survivors received at least one of your grant-funded support services in question 33A. Victims and survivors who receive services such as crisis intervention or victim advocacy in addition to basic hotline information and or referrals should be reported in question 33A. For question 33C, victim witness notification outreach to victims and survivors, report the number of unsolicited letters, phone calls, or visits you provided to victims and survivors. Only victims and survivors who responded to your contact and received additional grant-funded services listed in question 33A should be reported in question 27. And remember that this is grant-funded activities. In question 34, protection orders by type of victimization, report the total number of requests received by authority with power to grant a protection order for temporary and final protection orders and the total number of each granted by type of victimization. Again, these are grant-funded activities. And in question 35, the optional additional narrative question, feel free to talk about all of your grant-funded services, any barriers to service or success stories that you want to highlight. All of your narrative information is extremely valuable.